Glenn, Femi, okay. Today we return to a subject that we've touched on several times on the stream, and that's minorities in the US being involved in vaccine trials. Earlier, we spoke to public historian Mabel Rosenheck, who told us why it's so critical that minorities take part in these vaccine trials. Have a listen.
We advocate for diversity and inclusion in clinical trials, including challenge trials. There are social determinants of health, environmental conditions, housing, food availability that disproportionately impact non-white people and can impact reactions to vaccines and other medications. So any clinical trial must incorporate a diverse range of participants, non-white people, as well as people from a range of geographic and other kinds of backgrounds. Our advocacy works also involves starting a conversation around racism, equity, inclusion in medical ethics, health, and public health and vaccination far more broadly. COVID-19 vaccine is only the beginning of a longer project of anti-racist work in medicine.
So this potentially could be an uncomfortable conversation about race, medicine, COVID-19 vaccine trials. I know you're ready for it. Jump into the YouTube comments and you too can be part of today's show. Hello, Linda. Hello, Glenn. Oh my goodness, you're going to be tag teaming to greatness today. They have so much knowledge. They're about to splurge on you. Linda, reintroduce yourself to our stream audience. Go ahead.
Yeah. Hello, Femi. Thank you for having me. I'm Linda Goler-Blount, President and CEO of the Black Women's Health Imperative, the only national organization focused on Black women's health, emotional health, physical health, and financial health. I'm so happy to be here.
Welcome back. Hello there, Glenn. Tell everybody who you are.
Hi, Femi, Melinda. Good to see you both. I am Glenn Ellis. I'm based in Philadelphia. I'm currently a visiting scholar at the National Bioethics Center at Tuskegee University, and I'm also a fellow at Harvard Medical School in both research bioethics and narrative ethics.
I am going to jump straight into the YouTube comments when our audience knew we were doing this show. This comment here. Are you kidding? Are you not aware of the deep mistrust Afro-Americans have about the medical system? Review your history of medical apartheid and genocide in the US. We ain't having none of it. Linda, unpack that a little bit.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. And this is, as the writer said, this is deeply rooted in history. This is deeply rooted in 400 years of oppression in this country. And then, of course, colonialism outside of this country going even further back. I mean, the fact is, the reason we have trials is to ensure that vaccines or therapeutics are safe and effective. But they need to be safe and effective for everybody. And if we don't include everybody, then they're less reliable. And so in this country, where we've got a history that I know Glenn is going to speak to so well, of medical abuse, of horrific abuses. You go back to J. Marion Sims and the way he brutalized slave women, and obviously Henrietta Lacks and naming herself after her without her permission. But Femi, you can come to today. I happen to be in Georgia, and just a month ago, we saw where institutionalized Latinas were being sterilized without their permission. So this mistrust, this reluctance to participate in what comes across as experimentation is well-founded historically, but it's well-founded in what's happening today.
Glenn, I'm just going to jump back into YouTube again. Latonya Green-Warner. Latonya, thank you for joining us. She says, look up Tuskegee syphilis experiment. There is no trust anyway. Linda just reeled off a number of, I would just say, unethical experiments on Black people in the United States. Take one of them. Take the Tuskegee experiment, because within the US, people know that. Outside of the US, if they don't, they're going to be shocked when you tell them what happened briefly.
Thank you. Femi, this is a classic example of what it means when it says, until the lion gets its own story, tell us the story of the hunt is going to always glorify the hunter. And the first thing we have to acknowledge, there was no Tuskegee syphilis study. There was a U.S. Public Health Service study on syphilis at Tuskegee. It was only the exclusion of the fact that this was the United States government conducting this study of watching the progression of the disease of syphilis in uneducated, poor Black farmers. And we have now allowed the narrative to be about, first of all, a syphilis study, Tuskegee syphilis study, as though the university was actually the one that did it. But more importantly, we talk about this mistrust, and we don't even acknowledge that it's almost as though they think mistrust is something that we're born with, that there's some kind of genetic defect that Blacks have mistrust against healthcare. Instead of acknowledging and being accountable for the incredible racist history that Linda has just articulated, that has led to anybody with common sense mistrusting somebody who has demonstrated, as Linda said, for over 400 years that we don't matter. There's no example in this entire society's history where you can point to something that shows that African Americans and Blacks are actually a part of the overall objectives, goals, and aspirations of this country. It doesn't exist. So mistrust is totally the wrong term to use. It's like common sense and what people understand they need to do. That's the only way we've survived for the last 400 years.
Linda, the reason why I describe this as an uncomfortable conversation is because in medicine, you expect your medical professionals to take care of you regardless of what color you look like, where you live, what your resources are. Why does this not happen in the United States?
Yeah, it is uncomfortable, but it reveals the fundamental systemic racism that exists in our healthcare system. I mean, the number one reason, I mean, we as Glenn talked about, there's incredible historical mistrust and warranted, but the number one reason Black people don't participate in clinical trials is because they're not asked. Their physicians make all kinds of assumptions about what they will and will not do, whether or not they will comply, whether or not they will be able to travel, whether or not they have enough money. And so because of these racist perceptions, they simply don't ask their patients to participate. And so we leave out an entire group of people who could benefit. And just in case people think it doesn't matter, it does. When you look at, for example, the HPV vaccine, which has been demonstrated to prevent cervical cancer in women, the two strains that are most responsible for cervical cancer in Black women are not included in the vaccine. Well, there were no Black girls in those trials. Right. And so this absolutely does matter. And you come forward to COVID-19, there's a therapeutic dexamethasone, which has shown to be effective in people with severe disease. Well, it doesn't work as well in African Americans. No surprise, not included in the trials. So these things matter. And if our physicians would ask, just say, look, Ms. Smith, I think this trial will be really good for you. We're going to work with you to make sure that you have the best possible experience in this trial. It could make a huge difference, but it's just not happening.
Glenn, why is it not happening? I feel like if you know this, if we know about the inequities in the health system in the US, why are doctors not doing this?
Because racism and structural and institutional racism is really designed to protect the power and privilege that white people enjoy. So it's in their benefit, it's to their advantage and to their benefit to do everything not to dismantle it, because human nature says none of us like to lose power and privilege. That's just a gut human nature thing. So the structure is structural racism in our medical system. I want to say two things real quickly. One, I just got over my first ever sinus infection, and I feel like I should apologize to everybody I ever blew off who complained about a sinus infection, because it's a horrible experience. But anyway, the point is, I went to an ear, nose, and throat specialist on a referral from my doctor, my primary doctor. I get to the office, wait around, as you normally do. They call me into the waiting room. I go in, sit on the exam table, look up on the wall. there are 40 8x10 photographs of old white men doctors. So when the doctor who was seeing me came in the room and said, and introduced himself and asked what I was there for, I said, wait a minute, can you tell me what that's all about? He said, oh, those are some very great doctors. And they were very good mentors to the person who founded it. I said, well, doctor, let me ask you a question. How comfortable would you be if our roles were reversed right now and you came in here and there were 40 pictures of black men up on the wall in the exam room? He couldn't answer that. And this other point is just that how deeply steeped racism and how just being black has been medicalized to be a condition, a disease that goes back to the 17th, all the way to the origins of this country.
Glenn, I'm so glad you mentioned that, because we spoke to Colleen. We spoke to Colleen. I'm going to get you to pick up off the back of her, Colleen, about there's something wrong with black bodies. There's something wrong, which means that they're either used to be experimented on or avoided to be putting vaccine trials. This is how Colleen put it. Let's have a listen to her.
By framing Black Americans as biologically at risk for this disease, for COVID-19, we not only communicate the message that Black bodies are inherently defective and prone to the disease, we obscure the underlying structural causes for racial disparities in health. And these are the social determinants of health, including and especially medical racism. Biological race cannot be the basis for recruitment. Recruiters must reject this harmful logic because it ultimately subjects African Americans to disparate treatment in research settings. And they must also abstain from stigmatizing African Americans as irrational in their skepticism. And they must contend with the fact that those who are usually recruited first are often denied access to the therapies built upon their bodies.
Yeah. Glenn, I interrupted your thought there to bring Colleen in, but I know Linda in particular, you are fed up with black women being targeted as there's something wrong with black women. Right? I know you push back all the time.
Absolutely. And black women don't view themselves as we say, broke or broke down. I mean, we've conducted a study years ago where we asked black women to define health, and that is not our view. We know we're fine. We know there's nothing wrong with us. But there are the systemic barriers. And Glenn, I just want to touch on something you said. You talked about going to the doctor's office and you're waiting around. Well, Femi, to give you a sense of how ingrained, how entrenched systemic racism is, it is literally built into technology. The appointment scheduling systems, the artificial intelligence systems have racism built into them. I wrote a co-authored a paper with some colleagues last year that showed that racism is literally built into the intelligence, into the algorithms of scheduling systems, such that black people wait 2-3 times as long as white people to get an appointment. So if you're on a schedule, you go see your doctor, you've got a 3 o'clock appointment and it's suddenly 5 o'clock, of course you're going to leave and perhaps you won't come back. So this has real implications for our ability to access care and access quality care when racism is literally built into the technology, into the machine language of systems that control scheduling.
All right, Linda and Glenn, you have just laid this out perfectly. You've given it historical context. You've brought it up to date. Let me just show you here some of the trial pages from Pfizer. So I'm going down to Pfizer, and they are looking at the trial locations, the trial progress. This is for COVID-19 vaccines, participant diversity. And let's just look here. They're being pretty transparent. In the US, 5% Asian, 9% Black, Hispanic or Latinx 12%, Native American 0.7%. This works out about 25% of their current vaccine trial for COVID-19 is looking at minorities. Glenn, is that enough?
Well, first of all, why would we trust those numbers? Why? Why is it that if we have watched systemic exclusion of Black people in clinical trials, and I served on 5 different IRBs over the course of 15 years, so there's nothing about clinical research I don't understand and know. And I know there's no accountability. We already know systemically there is no universal system to collect racial data. So the first thing is, why should we trust what they say? Why?
Why should you not trust? It's 2020. We have Black Lives Matter movement. Everything is turned upside down for 2020. We have fault lines that we're really seeing right now. As a bioethicist, why are you're as cynical as the people on YouTube, Glenn?
And let me just say this. At the beginning of this pandemic, the guidelines, official formal recommendations were that if you think you have this virus, do not go to your doctor. Call your doctor so they can arrange for you to be tested. The data shows that a significant portion of Black people don't have a primary doctor. So who are they going to call? So it's just another example of how deeply embedded systemic racism is. So much so that we have Black Doctors COVID-19 Consortium in Philadelphia, which is a group of Black doctors led by Dr. Alice Sanford, who they're full-time doctors. She's a pediatric surgeon. And now she has to moonlight on Saturdays, Sundays, at night with another group of her colleagues to test Black people in parking lots at churches. Because now, how could we have an entire healthcare system, a public health system, and in a crisis like a pandemic, there's no inclusion of Black people just to be tested? So why should we trust what Pfizer says about how many Black people are?
Femi, I have to agree. In the early Moderna trials, and Moderna has NIH money, so this is government funding, and the government requires at least 9% Black participation. In the early Moderna trials, there were 2 Black people. So Glenn is right. There is no accountability.
Out of how many? I'm actually looking at their breakdown here of enrollment trends for vaccine. They're very low. So where you see these tiny little colors here, these are people, literally people of color. Green is Asian. Oh my goodness. I'm trying to read them. It's so tiny.
Right, exactly.
Blue is Black or African American. So it's like the very lowest numbers down here. These are all people of color. So you would think by publicizing this is like, we're being transparent. We're bringing people who are from minorities into,
no accountability.
And it's not happening.
Right. And if you're a pharmaceutical company, there's really no accountability. You're not getting government funding, so who's looking at you to make sure that you have appropriate representation in your trials? I mean, overall, only 4% of Black people participate in trials anyway, but given the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on the Black and brown population, Tony Fauci himself said people of color ought to be 66% of all trial participants, and we're nowhere near it.
Nowhere near that, absolutely. And Femi, could I just quickly say this? What we have to also not ignore in this conversation, 2 things. One, it's only a difficult conversation to the people who haven't experienced what we've experienced for 400 years. So I'm not in the business of trying to make people feel good about facing this subject, because I've had to watch what happened with my ancestors. But more importantly, why are we talking about a concept like race that is totally social based in the context of science, right? So you got to look at how as a society we've infused a social concept and made it a fundamental factor in science. That defies everything.
This is how Academy Health described exactly what you're saying. When considering race in data analysis, race is not a risk factor. Racism is the risk factor.
Exactly.
I keep trying to pull you two into, now what are we going to do? And you keep pulling me back into, it's terrible. So here's what I'm thinking. Linda, you call yourself, I'm just looking here on your social here, a guerrilla health advocate. Give us some guerrilla health strategies. Because if people of color, if minorities are being impacted by COVID-19 more than any other different groups, then we need some guerrilla tactics right now for vaccine trials. What are yours?
Absolutely. So one of the things that we're doing at the Black Women's Health Imperative is we have a partnership with Stand Up to Cancer and Friends of Cancer Research to actually train Black women on clinical research, clinical protocols, how to participate, what to expect, how to make sure that you get the best possible care and have the best experience, and to challenge the providers, challenge the researchers when you're participating in clinical trials to make sure that they know you're holding them accountable. But one of the things we also have to do is get the research community out of its segregated bubble. Researchers recruit from their networks that are known to them.
Absolutely.
Well, 98% of these researchers are not Black, so they don't have Black and brown people in their network. So we've got to make sure that they go to other scientific meetings, National Medical Association, others, and build a collegial relationship with people who don't look like them. Part of our problem is in actual segregation, and we already know that if we could end segregation today, we would end health disparities. But the other thing, I mean, is we got to make sure that we've got leadership, Black and brown leadership. Who's making the decision? Who's conducting the research? What becomes evidence depends on who's asking the questions, who they're asking, how the data is being analyzed, and we end up applying a body of evidence to people who had nothing to do with its creation in the first place. So we've got to change fundamentally who's making those decisions and who's getting funded.
All right, so Linda and Glenn, let me just slip in here, Greg Millett, because we were talking about trust, lack of trust, very valid in this theme. And Greg had a couple of suggestions about now what do we do? Let's have a listen.
The first consideration is that there is a big difference between a theoretical vaccine and a real vaccine. And you likely see changes in opinion when you have a real and effective vaccine that is available. The second thing that I think is important as well is it depends upon who is endorsing the vaccine. There's a recent poll that came out this week that showed that 2 in 10 Americans would take a vaccine if it were recommended by Donald Trump. But 6 in 10 Americans would take a vaccine if it were recommended by their doctor. So it's very clear that if there were a safe vaccine that was highly effective, that was recommended by their doctor or a member of their family, that you would likely see higher levels of African Americans who take that vaccine.
So Glenn and Linda, you've got people fired up on YouTube. Adrian King says, thanks, Adrian. Sounds like you know what the problems are. Tell me about the solutions, Glenn.
Well, I was just going to first piggyback off that last comment.
Do that first, and then see if you can then pivot. Yeah, go ahead.
When he talked about the study that showed that 6 out of 10 Americans would take the vaccine, who are those Americans? Who did they talk to? Who are they? We don't have the accountability comprehensively to really know how to address these solutions. So the first step is accountability. All you have to do to get a protocol approved by IRB is check off a box and say, yes, I plan to include Blacks. Look at the lack of accountability to the FDA that has systemically approved drugs, devices, and treatments, knowing that the data is devoid of any inclusion of Black people. So we don't even have an accountability system in place to start talking about breaking down and making solutions, in my opinion. The first step is, who are they? And these other people who are, in terms of who, it depends on who's promoting it or who's saying it. I mean, the president of some very prestigious historically Black colleges have publicly made it clear that they're enrolling. But I'm just saying.
So Glenn and Linda, we're in the last minute of the show, so I'm just going to push you, okay? And
already?
You've got your third, already, a 30-second elevator pitch, okay? Glenn, would you take part in a COVID-19 vaccine trial? Yes or no, and why? 30 seconds.
Well, right, absolutely not. And primarily for me, it's because I know too much about clinical trials for vaccines. It's the warp speed concept, and all of the accountability has been turned over to the private pharmaceutical companies.
Linda, would you take part in a COVID-19 vaccine trial? Yes, no.
I mean, when there's a national scientific association made up of Black researchers, physicians, clinical trial experts who have complete visibility and transparency into the data, the analysis, and the protocols, and they say, yes, we endorse this, then I'll do it.
All right, that's a no from Linda and a no from Glenn. Thank you, YouTube. Really appreciate your questions today. Thank you, Linda. Thank you, Glenn. See you next time, everybody. Thanks for watching.